Good morning. Can we now move to our second session, which is focused specifically on the games sector? And can I welcome Joe Twist, the Chief Executive of the Association for UK Interactive Entertainment, Ian Livingstone, long-standing supporter of the industry but currently Life President of IDOS, Richard Wilson, the Chief Executive of Tiger, and Vincent Shearer, also representing Tiger. Jim Sheridan, sir.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning. Could I just start once again, if you could perhaps give us a flavour for what you see your role in helping the games sector succeed, and what, in your opinion, is the main challenges that perhaps government could assist you with?
Tiger is the trade association that represents UK game developers and digital publishers, in particular independent developers and digital publishers. We set up back in 2001. And we see our role as helping the UK games industry to be the best in the world. That's what we're aiming to achieve. And we have three broad activities. One is ensuring the industry is properly represented at a political level. Second, raise the profile of the industry, particularly in the mainstream media, so that people understand how important the industry is economically and particularly. And thirdly, we try to help our members commercially, providing best practice information, advice, networking, and enhancing their commercial opportunities. So in those various ways, we try to support the industry. In terms of the key challenges, over the last few years, the key challenge has certainly been the unlevel playing field which the industry has been competing on in the UK. Our key competitors have had tax breaks against production, the UK hasn't. Skills have been another issue, and I would also single out the need for managers and leaders in the UK games industry to continue to enhance their skills. Many of them moving into self-publishing now, publishing their own content, and this creates new challenges for them. So I think tax and skills are particularly the key challenges facing the sector.
What do you mean by unlevel playing field and your competitors? Who are they?
Yeah, so for example, in Canada, the United States, they've had tax breaks against production, which have effectively reduced the cost of game development in those jurisdictions. The UK hasn't had a tax break against production. Fortunately, one is going to come into effect from April this year, assuming the European Commission gives the green light to that. Once we have a tax break in place, the competition will be fairer, the level playing field. There'll be more of a level playing field between different countries.
Anyone else?
So, my name's Joe Twist. UK Interactive Entertainment exists to represent the entirety of the games industry, from the smallest of developers and one-person studios to the largest multinationals and publishers in the country, and again to try and support, grow and promote the industry to make sure that the UK is the best place to make and sell games and interactive entertainment. As we heard from the previous session, convergence is a major factor in terms of what games can do and the expectation of interactive entertainment as a whole. For us, there are 6 main issues. The first is obviously the supply of skills. Now that includes creative, artistic as well as technical skills into the industry, and as well as immigration issues. And we already had one big policy win thanks to the government and thanks to the work that the Next Gen Skills Coalition campaign, which Ian led on and did magnificent work on, and which Ukie members paid for. We got success with the disapplication of boring ICT and instead in place computer science. And it's very important that we continue to support teachers and to support educators to make sure that that is implemented in a rigorous fashion. As Richard has already said, the tax breaks were the second big policy win, and we're very grateful for that, because we do want to be recognised as one of the key cornerstones of the creative industries and the digital economy future for this country. And we want to make sure, and we're working very closely with government colleagues, in order to ensure that the tax breaks implementation and the cultural test recognises all parts of the industries, from the smallest developers to the largest multinationals who will be making inward investments. The third is access to finance, and we particularly have done a lot of work on crowdfunding, as you heard from the previous session as well. We believe in innovative access to finance as one of the key to the ecosystem, and we want to consider how we can boost the take-up of SEIS and EIS schemes. Crowdfunding is extremely popular with developers, and late last year, Kickstarter, the most successful of crowdfunding platforms, launched in the UK. £2 million was pledged in donation support for various projects in its first month. 1.2 million of that was for games projects. In 2012, Kickstarter called 2012 the Year of Games. We also want to do much more work and seek support from government to help to grow clusters outside of London. Tech City is not the only cluster in the world and in the UK, and in fact in the games industry we have other key clusters, including in Dundee, Leamington Spa and elsewhere. In terms of IP, it's very important that we do seek to protect and exploit the IP creation, which is very important and a backbone to our industry. But we, as an industry, are very innovative and agile in terms of coping with different forms of IP exploitation, including the freemium model on mobile phones, which has basically made piracy very much redundant in terms of mobile space. However, it has brought up other IP protection issues. And finally, we do want to work closely with government to help measure the industry, the size of our industry. Currently, the statistics do not match up to what we think is the economic impact of our industry, which is in great transition.
Could I just confirm that you're still based in Dundee? Because there was some talk earlier on about moving on, was it?
Sorry, say that again.
There was some talk earlier on about leaving Dundee, the games industry leaving Dundee for various reasons.
The games industry won't be leaving Dundee, as far as I understand. There's a lot of support for growing companies and for talent pipeline, and that's one of the key success to growing an ecosystem that creates a cluster.
Okay.
I'd just like to say, try and put the games industry in perspective, into context of the other creative industries. The games industry is the largest entertainment industry in the world. It's worth $50 billion a year in software sales alone. That's going to rise to $90 billion by 2015. And the UK, historically, has been very good at making games. And yet, without help, it's been successful. Now, what I'd like to see more of is a number of items to help the industry across the board. One is raising the profile and the perception of games to make people, parents, teachers, government, media, to understand it's a really strong and viable career option. And on the back of that, it becomes an investable industry for external finance. We're very good at creating intellectual property in this country. We're not so good at retaining it. We often have to give away our IP in return for project finance. And not just parking the copyright issues, we do happen to have a very good copyright law. But we're so often a work-for-hire nation in this country, in all our content-creating industries. So whilst we get the Oscars, the BAFTAs, most of the revenues derived from our content is often banked overseas. And how can we create a competitive and yet fair tax regime linked to UK production that allows for intellectual property to be retained in this country? And two of the most important things, of course, three of the most important things, including broadband. It's not games that make people violent, it's latency. What we need is to get people to be able to not only download, but for content creators to actually upload content to global audiences via super hi-fi broadband. And the two most important things, of course, is access to finance and people. We're delighted with the announcement of production tax credits. It's going to make the UK a level playing field. And of course, we're delighted that schemes like SEIS and EIS continue to help the games industry. But the most overriding thing for me is being a skills base. Now, you may be aware of the Next Gen Skills Campaign, the Next Gen Report, which led to Michael Gove change the ICT curriculum, because historically ICT had been teaching children how to use technology, but gave them absolutely no insight how to create technology. We were effectively teaching children how to read, but not how to write. Now, the skills of computer science, computer coding are transferable. It's not just about making the next Angry Birds in the UK, of which there's been 1 billion downloads, by the way, and there's a great opportunity for anyone anywhere in the world to make those games in this country. It's also transferable, whether it's fighting cybercrime, designing a NetJet propulsion engine, or building financial packages. Computer code is everything at the heart of the digital world in which we operate today. So we have to turn our nation of digital literates into a nation of digital makers, not just using technology, but making technology. Digital manufacturing is our future, not traditional manufacturing, I would say, at this moment in time.
Vincent?
It's interesting. I've been working, my day job is as a lawyer representing SMEs who create video games. And for the first time in the last 15 years, I'm actually more positive about the video games industry than about the wider economy, although that's partly a reflection of the wider economy rather than the games industry. The three things that really have happened that have been extremely relevant for us. The production tax credit, I think, is going to be a major impact, have a major impact on the UK industry. The advent of crowdsourcing, particularly Kickstarter coming to the UK at the end of last year, as Joe mentioned, is a very, very important development as well. I think we'll probably talk more about that later. But also the advent of Apple and Google as distributors, so that a small company can create a game maybe for £100,000, and sell that game directly to the entire planet. There'll be 1 billion smartphones soon, and take 70% of the margin, with the other remainder going to Apple and Google, is an epic or kind of an industry-changing development that's happened. In terms of what Tiger is doing, other than assisting its members generally to navigate those things, I think the big challenge we have is going to be taking the production tax credit when it hopefully is implemented, and actually making sure that the industry actually is able to use it. When Tiger was set up, the R&D tax credit was already available, but no one knew that it existed or that it applied really to the video games industry. Accountants didn't know that it applied to the games industry because there weren't broken pipettes or people buying stuff. So people didn't claim for it. And one of the things Tiger did right from the beginning was to make sure that everyone in the industry who made games understood that there was a tax credit for R&D. And that actually took a lot of work, going to see people, running events. I remember a number of events in Dundee about that, to encourage people to take up that tax credit, and I think we'll have the same job. We've already started it. We had an event in Dundee last year, and in other sectors, in other hub areas, explaining to people what the tax break was going to be, and actually making sure that people implement it and use it is going to be, I think, a big challenge of ours in the next few months.
Just on the question of SMEs, just how easy is it to start up an SME in the industry, and what is the composition currently in terms of SMEs and multinationals?
It's extremely easy to set one up. I mean, the beauty, I think, the thing that's really, we lose track of this in the UK, in that it is extremely easy to set up a company in the UK. I was at an event in Switzerland where we met games companies and small companies in Switzerland, and it's very, very hard to set up a company there. There isn't also the entrepreneurial mindset, people wanting to. Families saying, well, yeah, go into business because it's great, rather than going to be employed by someone else. So in that respect, the environment here is extremely positive. It's much, much closer, I think, to Silicon Valley than it is to anywhere in continental Europe. And if I were anywhere in continental Europe looking to set up a game, I'd be coming to the UK.
But what is the composition, SMEs, multinationals?
So the vast majority of studios in the UK will be SMEs. As of December 2011, there were 329 studios in the UK, and almost all of those, I mean, something like 96-97% would have been less than 250 employees that were classified as SMEs. We'll be updating those numbers within the next month, I hope, with some new data. But the vast majority of development studios will be small companies. I mean, so in Scotland, for example, I think the vast majority, with the exception of Rockstar, the vast majority have less than 50 staff.
Ian, I was
just going to say it's all about being able to empower creative people with the right skills and access to finance to be able to start their own business. There aren't many jobs out there, so if you have a skilled workforce that has content that is valued by the investment community, by government, by media, they're more likely to be able to build studios with small agile teams that can scale to global markets. And that's very important to have that encouragement to enter our industry, because it is the largest entertainment industry in the world, yet it remains largely a hidden success story, especially for the UK.
Overall, how many jobs are in the industry?
About 9,000 in development.
9,000.
In development alone, much more in terms of the entire games industry and supporting companies.
But the whole industry is moving, it's going through an incredible transition period at the moment. It's moving from a box product to a digital service. It's moving from an analog to a digital consumption and creation. And therefore, small, agile teams are able to create content and serve it to global audiences via high-speed broadband. The supply chain is being completely reduced. Historically, you used to have to extend incredible amounts of production money, investment, in the tens of millions of pounds to make a physical product that's put on a truck, put in the shop, distribution, costs, before you actually reach the end user. Today, there's a direct communication between the content creator and their consumers, and they're able to iterate and serve content and monetize that often free content at extraordinary rates. And there's no barrier other than skills and access to finance and a willingness to do so.
Can I make a point on the figures? I think this is one of the biggest issues that we face, particularly as we welcome the tax breaks and the change in terms of mending the skills pipeline. We need a benchmark to start with, and then an understanding, as the film industry has, of the economic impact of the tax breaks, and understanding how we do that is critical. I mean, Skillset estimate that there are 485 companies in the games industry. DCMS say there are 200 development studios. DCMS says the games industry employs 28,000 people, including 9,000 developers, but these are old figures, need updated. Many of our companies are not represented in the right SIC codes, and we welcome the consultation on SIC codes. But we are such a fast-changing industry that we need help to understand who is starting up and who is clustering. We did a recent business model survey of 50 games companies, and nearly 40% of them alone had formed since 2009, which is a factor of the lower barriers to entry to game creation, which is a fantastic thing. But in terms of startups and SMEs, you know, a lot of the companies do need plain English help in understanding. And again, I would welcome this starting at school and at further education in terms of learning how to run a business, learning more about those soft skills and entrepreneurial skills, which I know Tiger are very supportive of as well.
Just finally, am I correct in assuming that your industry is very much dependent on the film industry, a number of which, I mean, films are very violent. There is a school of thought among some people, none more so than the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who is concerned about the influence that your industry has on young people. Our
industry is an extremely mature industry, mature media, and we welcome the implementation of PEGI. The industry has worked very hard to ensure that parental controls on all the major consoles exist, that we have information and guidance for parents just as the film industry does. Violent games and 18-rated games, in fact, only constitute 7% of the total box games market. There's a huge diversity of games that's suitable for all audiences, and parents need to be educated in terms of the tools that they have at their control and in terms of the maturity of the industry that caters for all audiences and tastes.
I got the impression that you anticipated that question.
I was just about to add that people often... It's not often reported the positive aspects of games in the media at all, or understood by government. The fact when you're playing a game, you're solving puzzles and problems, you're learning about choice and consequence, you're learning about intuitive learning, you're learning about technology, social aspects. Games can be used as a learning tool to teach mathematics. Games can be used as a training tool for training pilots, the armed forces, and surgeons in a very friendly environment. Games technology is all pervasive. President Obama said this week that games can make education relevant for young people and cited Mark Zuckerberg's interest in games as leading him to want to learn to program, which in the end in turn led to him making Facebook. How are we in this country going to use games in a positive way to send out a great message that it's not just about making the games, it's all the creative and digital industries can benefit from an interest in games and turn that interest in playing games into a career of making them and also other industries. Now, getting back to the violence aspects, games are often cited blames for the evil of society, most recently with the shootings in the United States. But the facts are, in the United States, there's $13.6 billion spent on games in the United States, $7 billion spent in Japan, and $3 billion spent in the UK. Now, Japan's spending is probably twice that per capita on video games, and yet, if you look at the number of firearm deaths in the United States per 100,000 people, there's 10 in the United States, there's 0.07 in Japan, and 0.025. So it's 100 multiple of firearm deaths in the United States. So clearly it can't be linked to games. So every time anyone tries to link anything heinous to games, they never have the facts. It's just an emotional thing put out there. People have never played a game in their lives.
Our perception is that argument is largely going away anyway. In fact, the people who are now running it are mostly the head of the NRA, who was desperately trying to deflect attention from the firearm sellers. He was, I think, the only person in the United States, at least on TV, to say, oh, it's all the video games industry, rather than obviously his members who were providing the assault rifles and the ammunition to American citizens. It's part of the industry growing up. 100 years ago it was the novel, and then it was the violent comic book, and then it was Elvis Presley, and then it was every so often, and it's part of the video games industry growing up. Someone else will be blamed afterwards. It's soon it'll be Facebook or someone else will be blamed, and people will learn.
To measure it in terms of the film industry, we're only in the 1930s, yet we've achieved so much in a relatively short period. And we are growing up as an industry, and I think that's being witnessed by your interest here today.
Apologies, but Elvis Presley will be leaving the building.
I'm positive about the prospects of the industry, but you have said huge transition. For some people, the perception is that games has sort of peaked. There was a time when there were 3 stores on every high street. Now they've all gone. HMV's disappearing. You're moving, into streaming online distribution. But also, it seems sales have slowed down a bit. Platform sales are slowing down.
This is another significant point about data in our industry. At Ukie, we've got a PC download, digital download charts in beta. At the moment, those kinds of stories are based on the box product sales.
Right.
As we transition, as every other industry, following the needs and the changing behaviours of consumers in the 21st century, we are moving towards digital. And then again, it's up to us as an industry to try and capture those sales figures and try and capture those figures in order to represent the industry fully, so that we don't hear those stories. The high street market is extremely important for the games industry in terms of the visibility of games as a mainstream form of entertainment. But the market looks after itself at the end of the day.
The high street is largely, I think, finished. The concept of a digital product being delivered to people's homes via a shop is I think, on its way.
Unless you like shoes.
It won't be gone totally. But
we're following the music industry. Clearly, they've got much smaller files. We've got much larger data in our files. But the fact the games industry is technology-driven like no other industry. Facebook is now a games platform. It was 400 million people playing games on Facebook. There are hundreds of millions of people playing games on smartphones. Everyone's carrying a games platform around in their pockets. And if they're not playing Angry Birds, they're playing social games like Words with Friends or chess online. The games industry is evolving all the time now. It's now become a mainstream entertainment industry.
It is, but there's the problem. I play Words with Friends. I play Angry Birds. I play Mafia Wars. All sorts of games. All the ones it's research. All the ones I've mentioned, I don't pay a penny for.
Mm.
Yeah, you don't, but enough people do for games like Clash of Clans gets $500,000 a day in revenue from sale of virtual goods inside those games. Between 1% and 5% of people have either got an ego problem or impatience, and they're willing to spend money inside those games for a more rich experience or a faster experience.
But is it
and that's a growing market for each
yours
play.
is not like the music industry, where physical product is disappearing. It's all going into download.
It's an
but
addition
they're not
to-
making any money out of it.
It's a mixed economy and a really diverse range of business models. From Paymium, i.e. you still pay that upfront fee, but you might get it delivered digitally as opposed to from the high street, to, as Ian said, the free-to-play model, which microtransactions play a strong part. And ultra fans and people who love the features of that brilliant game are willing to pay incrementally for that.
And there's great examples of the UK doing well in the free-to-play model, whether it's a company like Playdemic up in Manchester with its Facebook games called Village Life. There's subscription models like Jagex and Mind Candy with RuneScape and Moshi Monsters. Boss Alien with their racing game done extraordinary numbers. So, and we just have to recognise it and make sure that the world understands what we're doing, and we're very good. We are perhaps the most creative nation in the world. Look at our film, our fashion, our music, etc., and of course our games.
But
it's the marriage of art and science that drives our ability to make games. It's just that we've never had the support from anyone, from government, from finance, from the media, to help drive this industry bigger than it should have been today.
There is a view, particularly among the younger generation, that things that they get off the internet should be free. And you are confident that demise of physical product and replacement by download or streamed content, nevertheless you can still achieve the same returns that you did?
Yes.
Well, Zynga, case in point, it IPO'd at $9 billion with all their products are free to play. They monetize in-app purchases inside those games. There are hundreds of millions of people playing these games. If 1% of anything, 1% of those players are spending several dollars a day on that game for an enhanced experience, then it's a successful thing. You don't actually physically buy a film when you go to the movies. You're buying an entertainment experience.
Sure.
Similarly with a game, you're paying for some entertainment additional to the basic offering.
The industry has been very good at having a fantastic relationship with its fans, the players. It's extremely important to protect that relationship. And, when you price something right, you make it accessible at the right time in the way that people want it, your fans want it, then people are willing to pay.
You can't fight the market, and you can monetize free. either through in-app purchases or through advertising, or you pay not to have the advertising.
There are
ways
losers.
to monetize.
Yeah. So there are definitely losers in this thing. That we used to be very good at making very large-scale console projects as well as small projects, and that since the cost of making a big game has gone from maybe £250,000 when I started off to up to £100 million, those projects are simply no longer being done by independent companies anymore. And that was somewhere where we were very big in the UK in the past. And so companies that really focused on large console developments for external publishers are struggling a lot, and they're going to struggle a lot more when we make the transition to the next console. The other issue is if one looks at price points, one might play a game on a smartphone, and the price is usually maybe £1. People will balk at paying £2 or £3. On any other model, an entry-level price would be £10, and games would go up to 40 or 50. And we don't yet know how that's going to play out. But the consumer is okay with paying on smartphones, but the consumer will view £3 as being a horrifically high price, and yet would view £10 as being, which traditionally for PC games, £10 was the entry-level impulse buy. I'll just get it as a tenner. That's nothing. And yet in on iPhone, it's now too high.
Yeah.
And that is on the iOS. Actually, it's interesting. There was a survey last year which showed, based on about 250 companies and their games on the iOS platform, and of those, 50% had made less than $3,000 per game. I think 25% have made more than $30,000 per game over the lifetime of that game. So there will be some breakouts which were very, very successful. But because it's so easy in many ways to launch games, obviously the marketplace is extremely competitive, and to an extent that probably drives down the price.
And I think Vincent makes an extremely valid point in terms of large major development studios and companies setting up in the UK. And what we hope, obviously, is the attraction of a lower corporation tax, the tax breaks, as well as the skills gap being fixed, that this will encourage more companies to locate their businesses in this country, not just in London, significantly. And we're doing a lot of work. We think this promotional point, we're embarking on quite a large promotional campaign, one to educate developers about the tax breaks and how they will work for them, but also to promote, working very closely with UKTI and Number 10's Great campaign, in order to highlight the fantastic businesses that we do have here and talent that we have here. And I think that's extremely important. The music and film industry has had a lot of support, strategic agency help, in order to do that and to do trade missions and to sell the UK abroad. And that's the next step that we need to really tackle as an industry.
We're delighted what's happened in recent years with the government's approach to the industry. Ed Vaze in particular has been a great supporter of the industry. He's been behind the Next Gen Skills campaign, he's behind the tax production tax credits, and he's sending out a great message beyond these walls.
Good. I'm on specifically the government's assistance. Paul.
Obviously, John is either so skilled or so pure that he's never felt tempted to buy a Mighty Eagle or Millennium Falcon and birds just to blast your way through to the next level. So, I just wanted to ask what you were just talking about with Ed Vaze and some of the things that have been going on in government. It would have been quite easy to get the impression from some of the evidence that the industry felt itself in somehow the poor relation of film, TV, and music within government. But what you've just been saying has sort of changed that impression. And Vincent, what you were saying was an industry very confident itself. And Joe, I can imagine you going into the biz and jolting them into the 21st century, those civil servants, by bowling the minutiae of standard industrial classification codes at them as well. So where do you think the government is not getting it right for you? Are the civil servants behind the ministers now? Is there still a...
I think they are. I sense I've only been in this job a year, so I'm coming in from the outside, as it were, and from Channel 4 and BBC worlds, which are quite different. But I sense an enormous positivity and understanding, and it's part of that is because your children and grandchildren, maybe in some cases, not around this table, of course, are playing games. So there's a greater understanding as the widening audience for games increases. More than 1 in 3 people play games in this country. The average age is 30-something. It's not just a kid's thing. It is mainstream entertainment, and it's the expectation of entertainment in the future generations. So we've had a lot of support as Ukie, and we've met with 3 government cabinet ministers in the past few months, a range of MPs. We have constant support from BIS and DCMS, and I do sense there is a change and a shift in recognising that everything we ask for as a games industry actually makes us fit for purpose in terms of what the digital economy requires. So I will use crowdfunding as the example there.
You're going to come on to
We'll
that.
come on to that, so I'll use that later.
And we're going to come on to the details of the tax credit. But do you feel anywhere where the government, the civil service, the advisors are lagging behind in any way, where they could do some more for you?
I think the civil service tends to be slow in terms of they don't like change, because change is a risk. We're not in this country always great at risk. Whereas, when you're making games, you have to make mistakes to learn from those mistakes and move on. And the creative industries themselves have often been seen as sort of fluffy industries run by a bunch of lovies. So I actually welcome the Creative Industries Council as being a good thing to put the sector on the map, to be seen on equal status as pharmaceuticals and the financial sector. And the Creative Industries Council, I do sit on it, so I would say this, I guess, but it has been already produced 2 reports, access to finance reports and a skills report, that have been well received, and I'm sure a lot more is to come. And the games industry is good to be seeing have a good seat on that table.
It got a bit of a pummelling in the past session, where it was stylised as barely having met.
The point was, nobody creative is on that council. Well, I make games for a living, so I'm on that council. So, and there are other people who actually part of the craft process as well. The only thing that is slightly odd is that it's the definition of the creative industries needs to be looked at, because it's kind of 13 disparate industries. Some relic, like arts and crafts, some service, like advertising, and some content companies, like content industries, film, TV, and games, to name but 3.
Where and how could it be sharpened?
Pardon?
How could it be sharpened?
I think UK Trade Investment could still do things to support the industry more effectively. They are helpful. They do things to help the sector. They run the Trade Assistance Programme through trade associations. We've suggested to UK Trade Investment on a number of occasions they should use the TAP funds more flexibly to help cover accommodation and travel costs, and not just simply for exhibition costs. So when the Trade Assistance Programme was originally set up, I think it was primarily being used to help manufacturers to display big products. But in the digital world, where video games obviously don't take up a huge amount of exhibition space, I think you could look to use the grants more flexibly, especially actually because we have so many small and startup companies that operate in the UK games industry. I think if you could help more of them to travel to overseas trade shows, I think that'd be a useful, an effective way of using the money actually, without actually increasing the total budget for UK Trade Investment. So I think using the grants more effectively will be more useful. And just going back to your point about how government and political parties supporting the industry, I mean, I think compared to 5 years ago, I think there seems to be much more universal support for the sector. Whereas 5 years ago, I think we were still making the case. No longer seems to be the issue anymore.
I'd like to just put my penny in for the civil service. There's a team at BIS with Lynn Kilpatrick, who's now at DCMS, who were very strongly supportive and who helped found Tiger in the first place. And they've always been very, very supportive. I think part of the difficulty was, from a political level, there was always the fear of the Daily Mail headline, people bludgeoned to death because of video games. And one can date that change to the release of Grand Theft Auto 4, which is a British-made game that I think the Daily Mail gave 5 out of 5 rather than a kind of a terrible headline. And it grossed $500 million in 7 days. And it was and that really put the British games industry into the mainstream, and it wasn't just that we were bad people anymore, it was actually we were creating things that can be commercially very successful and that people very much like.
If people understand the sort of cultural, social and economic contribution of the games industry to the society, and it's a main component of the digital economy going forward, with traditional manufacturing said flat and financial service in disarray, surely these are the industries that should be promoted at all levels.
Before we go on to finance, can I just finish off the conversation about the Creative Industries Council, which has had praise from you and a walloping in the previous session. I asked the question, how could the Creative Industries Council be sharpened in your mind? You said in the side it was still full of arty, crafty...
Well, it's making... It's sending out a positive message to say to be seen as a sector, as an important sector, rather than a number of disparate, loosely connected industries. To see that the content's being created. You know, as I said earlier, we were often seen as a work-for-hire nation. We've got to be able to not just create, not just retain, but also protect the intellectual property, because value in companies can only be built by owning long-term value, owning long-term intellectual property, and scaling that in the digital context to global audiences worldwide. So, you know, making sure that we're an investable sector, perhaps have a creative institute or a creative industries bank, as in addition to crowdfunding, to make sure that people see the real value, and it's no more risky than any other traditional industries in the analog world. The digital creative industries is very investable because of the global potential of the content that it's creating. And we're so good at creating content, but we always seem to lose it, having to sell it short term in return for project finance, rather than going the whole hog and scaling it to its ultimate potential.
Brings us neatly onto financing issues.
So, just to finish off the Industries Council point, the chairman of Tiger, Jason Kingsley, who runs a studio in Oxford called Rebellion, I think he would echo one of the points in the last session about having more people on the Creative Industries Council actually run companies, who are actually running operations, running digital businesses. So I think that would just be his recommendation on how might improve that particular council. To answer your question directly.
Who would like to lead on first on telling us about the arrival of crowdfunding, the prospects for it, how important it might be, and how it plays into the regulatory system that covers collective investment?
So we released a report this time last year on crowdfunding and how the legislation could be tweaked in order to enable ordinary people, not just high net worth individuals, to have an equity-based crowdfunding model in the UK. There are basically three models that crowdfunding platforms operate largely, and Kickstarter falls under the first one, which is a donations model. So this is where people will back a project and get a perk or something in return that is not equity-based. And Kickstarter, as I said, is the classic example of this model. In the US, under the Jobs Act, they're trying to change legislation so that they can allow or operate a equity-based model. The second is the debt model, where a wide pool of investors will loan money on agreed repayment terms, and Funding Circle operates that model in the UK. And then we have the equity model, where people will take a stake in the company in return for an investment. And Seedrs is an example of a crowdfunding platform that operates this model. Now, crowdfunding has been broadly welcomed by all political parties, and the internet has enabled crowdfunding to happen in a way that is more structured. Unfortunately, FSA regulation hasn't kept up in step and in time with the digital economy and things that the internet allow people to be able to do. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding and a bit of fear factor, and what needs to happen is more guidance and more acceptance and recognition of crowdfunding as a legitimate way to get investment. And Ukie, we did this report last year, and then we also chaired and facilitated the creation of the first crowdfunding association in the UK. And through that association, we hope that government will work hard with us and across government departments to ensure that crowdfunding is understood and recognised, and to ensure that more crowdfunding platforms can operate an equity-based model and get approval from the FSA to operate this model, which will benefit not just the games industry, but a whole cross-section of sectors outside the creative industries as well. So essentially, the current regulatory frameworks around equity-based models are not designed for crowdfunding and the internet age. So that's what we would urge government and across government departments to work on.
I think one needs to distinguish between two very different types of crowdfunding. There's the, as Joe mentioned, there's the Kickstarter style, where one just gives money and it is forbidden to have any form of financial return whatsoever. They're very, very clear about that, and they don't want any form of, they don't want the law to be changed in the UK, for instance, for that. And the other is where people can put their money in and they might get something back. In that second case, the relationship is totally different, because the bringing that kind of financial incentive in has a corrupting influence on the relationship between the person putting the money in and the recipient, or potentially has a corrupting influence. One ends up with people putting money in order to have a massive return, which may or may not happen, rather than actually handing over money that one knows isn't will just be lost. There might be a credit in the game, but there might not, but actually that money is lost. So there is no, in the Kickstarter case, there is no prospect of anyone putting their life savings into a video game project, which is a very high-risk project on any level, and people don't necessarily know that. With the equity-style investment, there is that risk, and in fact there are already in existence institutions that are trying to receive money to fund games where people are putting vast sums of money of their own life savings, taking money out of their mortgages to put in already, and that's something that I think one would be very, very concerned about.
But I think, the UK has a real opportunity to attract, again, companies, crowdfunding platforms to actually base themselves in the UK rather than the Netherlands in some examples of crowdfunding platforms, if the legislation and the FSA regulation was, made more fit for purpose for this kind of activity.
The Jobs Act is good in the sense that they say, OK, we can allow people to gamble some money on a potential return, but we'll limit the amount they can put in. If they're small investors, you can only put in, I think, $2,000 per year. They also have a number of very clear requirements as to disclosure, people understanding what the risks are, and they're being and fully understanding that they might not get any of their money back, and so on. And they spend a lot of time doing that, although the regulations haven't been thrashed out yet. But one would certainly want to see something like that happening in the UK if the FSA rules on collective investment schemes were changed. I think the other point being that really, in the equity one, a company is giving up equity in return for money, whereas under the Kickstarter crowdsourcing model, you just get the money.
I think at the end of the day,
IP, you're not giving up any equity, you're not giving up any of the profits, and any company would want to go along that route first and any other route.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's also about giving people the option and giving, trusting people with guidance to actually spend their money and invest in the way that they might want to invest. So whether that be through donations, simple donations model, or an equity, more choice is better and will increase competition. Centuries
of history that might come down against you there, Joe. But Ian, you've been a veteran of the old-fashioned way of, or the newly stylised old-fashioned way of the city underwriting and raising money and distributing shares in that way. In what way can we practically support these initiatives in this modern digital day and age, whilst also offering sufficient protection to investors? What can be improved?
I think it's very important that UK citizens understand the opportunity, both as someone making an offer and to those that are taking advantage of that offer, because the financial sector seems to strangle at the moment, especially for games companies. You walk into a bank today and say you've got this great idea for a game, and the bank manager looks at you rather like an Alsatian watching television and just kind of nods strangely and urges you out the door. And yet we're a very investable sector. So we have to understand the portfolio approach, which you can do through crowdfunding, and understand that people who might not ordinarily be able to raise finance can do so through crowdfunding. So we need to get the regulatory requirements around crowdfunding sorted out sooner rather than later, because it's an immense opportunity for people with sometimes obscure content to reach an audience who would not ordinarily been able to get that content, but they desperately would like to do so. It's always been the gatekeepers, traditional gatekeepers, who've stopped innovation in many ways from happening.
But again, with the crowdfunding, you're essentially doing what Apple and Google are doing in being able to distribute apps and games. You're seeking out you've got the technology to advertise your wares, in this case, be it shares or
well, I think
of course you have
to a wider audience.
There's many potential problems. For every Angry Birds, there's probably 10,000 dead birds out there. So you have to go in there, eyes open, aware that not everything leads to success.
And
at least, but one of the arguments that would say, the regulators would say to you, well, at least in the city, that there's a sophisticated audience.
But I think there needs to be quite a lot of education with a lot of the VC community, not just in terms of the games industry and how we have transitioned from a product to a service, and how we've become, something different and a mixed model. But also, again, the fear factor. We do not have the same VC and investment climate as we do in Silicon Valley. And it is focused around London, naturally, but we need to focus that and de-risk, and crowdfunding allows for people to access finance in an innovative way, in different ways, even if they're not based in London around the financial capital.
And I'm not going to dwell on banks, because I think in many industries at the moment we're just giving up.
They were never very keen to put money into games, frankly.
What sources of public funding do do entrepreneurs in the industry benefit from?
It's pretty limited. There's the Abate Prototype Fund up in Scotland, in Dundee, of course, provides up to £25,000 of finance for developing prototypes. And I think they made about 58 to 60 awards so far. There have been about 300 applications to date. So that's a form of public finance, of course, public funding, which has been reasonably popular, and I think it's a worthwhile activity, worthwhile scheme to have, because investing in games is risky, so it's good to be able to have some public support for prototype funding. And then really we're looking at, there's obviously, going back to UK trade investment, the chance to get the trade assistance programme grants, that's another example. Then of course it's really going back to the tax system, where you've got obviously games tax coming into effect, and the research and development tax credits which you can go upon.
I would make a point about other public monies available. I mean, again, when you watch a film and you enjoyed the film and you can see at the beginning or at the end of the credits, there might be some lottery funding or film council funding or Film 4 or BBC Films. We don't have anything like that in the games industry, and I think it's probably about time we did. We have managed without that, but it's a real recognition of the cultural value of the content and the experience in games, and it's a signifier. And I would argue, having worked as a commissioner at BBC and as a commissioner at Channel 4, the fear factor around games and the misconception of games not constituting public service content, I think, is mistaken and flawed. Games are not just for children, and they are part and parcel of a modern, what a modern broadcast or content company should be commissioning and should be thinking about, and should be giving the opportunity for developers to create.
Well,
There's only 5% of games actually carry an 18 rating. 95% of the game that the media never talks about are family friendly.
I'm amazed, Joe, that having got 3 young kids, I've never come across international racing squirrels.
Oh, yay!
So I'm going to go and have a look at that when I get back to the office. Now, my colleague John Leach is going to ask about the film tax credit, but could I just give a gentle ease in on that with one final question? We had a tax credit proposed. It was then scrapped, and now the tax credit's coming back in again. What's been the effect on the industry in the meantime? What's the balance sheet of losses and gains for the industry?
Well, there was certainly more investment which we could have obtained, and jobs that might have been saved were forfeited. I mean, there was no advantage in delay, obviously. It's fantastic that everyone across the political divide now supports games tax relief. And it's worth saying, actually, in the run-up to the general election in 2010, all 4 political parties in the UK supported games tax relief and Tigers proposals in particular. So that was good news. Unfortunately, it didn't come into effect in the 2010 budget, but we're very glad it's come into effect now. But there's no doubt about it that jobs continue to be lost and investment opportunities are lost. Yes, absolutely. Yep. I mean, as you would have seen in our submission of evidence before, when we looked at the period 2008 to 2011, the Canadian games industry grew by 33% in terms of headcount, the French games industry grew by 25% in terms of headcount, and the UK games industry declined by 10% in terms of headcount. And I don't believe, and no one convinced me to believe, it was because our teams and our staff
the
UK
in the UK declined by 10%?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there was definitely an impact. So it's great that the games tax relief has come into effect now, and I'm glad that all political parties support it.
And we just need to make sure that obviously, the final implementation of that and the guidelines are very clear and recognise the nature of the industry in game production.
Yeah.
Paul's pinched the first question I was going to ask. It's like being back on the football pitch with him again. I want to come on to taxation, but I just want to raise 2 issues that have been mentioned already, mentioned by Joe. The first was in relation to cultural content. Is the problem, because I can well understand the argument for financial support from lottery, etc. But is the problem that there's a snobbery against the games industry that isn't there with the film industry?
I think, as Ian made the point earlier, and he probably will again, we're a young industry, we're 40 years old, and I think there is a cultural bias. It even comes down to when we talk about e-books, reading digitally as opposed to reading on paper. There's a real cultural bias which is changing, and I think again there's a cultural bias amongst, or potentially it could be called snobbery, which is changing, but there has been a cultural snobbery about games in the past, I would argue. Yet, we have a huge game-playing constituency in this country. It is mainstream. And I think that is rapidly changing as new platforms open up to new audiences.
Why is there that cultural bias against the industry then?
Because as humans, we naturally are culturally biased to anything that's different. We were naturally culturally biased against colour TV. We're naturally culturally biased against change.
I think also the historic headlines that have existed, some of the popular press, have always been negative. And we don't have the celebrity like film and TV have either. So there's never been a sort of photo opportunities for politicians to cozy up to the latest celebrity.
Although we do.
And everybody knows there's more to get. There's always been this negative perception around games until recently, until the advent of Facebook and smartphones. People who had never played a game always had a cultural bias, of course. If you've never seen a film before and asked you to go and see Texas Chainsaw Massacre and asked you to write a critique of the film industry, it's likely to be quite negative. Certainly if you only played one or two 18-rated games, which appears to have been happening in mainstream media, they've always written negatively about games, rather than all the wonderfully creative games that are now occurring across all platforms, and the fact that we're very good at it, and it's such a great contribution economically to this country, and it can grow.
But is this to do with the perception that games are for kids?
That's always been one of the main perceptions.
And because that brings me on to the second point I wanted to raise from what Joe had said earlier, and that was about the age profile of people who are playing games. I imagine the age profile, the average age is somewhere in the 30s because of my generation, the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. We were brought up with games. Yep. But is there an assumption within the industry that John will still be playing Angry Birds when he's 75? Or is there, so will that age profile continue to rise, or is there an assumption that at some time people stop playing games?
No, I don't think people won't ever stop playing games, I believe. I think, as you look at the different demographic breakdowns and different genres, the demographics shift all the time. And the average age is different, or the male-female split is different. At the moment, it's almost half-half in general for the whole population. The fact is that our game industry, given the ecosystem that we're creating and together supporting, will mean, and as we get the flow of diverse faces and talents and people into the industry who are inspired to have a great career in the industry, we will have more games that appeal to more audiences, no matter what age you are, no matter what background you have. So it's only going to diversify.
Doesn't that mean then there's bags of potential for the industry growing massively further than it already has?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as I said, it's $50 billion today. It's going to be $90 billion by 2015. This is just extrapolating figures already out there. There's the tipping points this year from moving from a boxed product sold at retail to a digital service. And anyone in the world, hopefully in the UK, can make content for global audiences. Now, there's so much more diversity in content today. Young and old are playing games, male and female, together. It used to be the dark arts. It was so the perception of the dark arts of the young teenager locked away in the bedroom. Then that came out into the living room with the Wii, and families started playing games together. Now we're all playing on connected devices, either together in the same room or over the internet. Games have become pervasive, and therefore the opportunity is there for everybody to take part in that.
But is this an expansion of people playing games, or is it just, in 50 years' time, will there still be people playing chess on a chessboard? Will there still be people playing Monopoly on a Monopoly board?
Yeah, I don't think everything.
So it's not replacing
games
those.
Playing. When we arrive in this world, we interact with it. We learn through play. I think we are playful by nature. We learn and we interact through play. It's just that we've always been too shy or too embarrassed to admit that actually we'd like to carry on playing throughout our lives. What is the cut-off point for games? There shouldn't be one. You just have to make appropriate content and appropriate devices so everybody can be included. When it's through the high point of the console gaming, which required a certain amount of knowledge and expertise to be able to manipulate a 15-button controller, suddenly along comes the iPad with swipe technology and Apple nailed the user interface, and suddenly a whole raft of new people can play games.
There is also, with cloud services, with increasing broadband infrastructure, with pervasive devices everywhere, and an always-on society, we do have members such as Hide and Seek who combine digital game playing and with physical games, physical street games or playground games, and it's all part of a play culture that, as a culture, we have lost. We do tend to think that that is for young people, and it's not. It's for everyone.
Let's still not just lose sight of the fact that we, as an industry, are all about the STEAM agenda, not just the STEM agenda. To have the art inside science, technology, engineering, and maths. And let's make our learning relevant and practical. Now, we're delighted that computer science is now being seen as the fourth science in the English baccalaureate, and that's a wonderful revision of the law and could be transformational for this country. But let's make our learning rigorous and robust to satisfy DFE, but at the same time, let's make it relevant and exciting for children to want to be part of it. Let's make sure it's not just a purely written examination. Let's make sure that half of that learning is practical, so we can make digital makers, whether it's learning how to play and make through games like Minecraft or Little Big Planet. Games can be a fantastic learning tool. And if it's just a written exam, question number one, who invented the World Wide Web? Interesting perhaps for a quiz night, perhaps interesting per se, but I'd rather have someone who can show me what they can code so I can give them a job tomorrow. So let's have course assessment and practical digital making skills part of that computer science curriculum rather than just another dry science.
And can I just just add to that, crucially, it is also about getting that diversity of people taking up those skills. So girls in particular. Last year, there were only 241 girls in the whole country who took computer A-level. That's shocking and appalling in a society where half our workforce are female.
Moving on to taxation, general consensus that the tax relief is a good thing for the creative industries. But in Ukie's written evidence, it stated that some important questions remain about how a tax relief scheme would function in practice. What are those questions or concerns that you have?
Well, for example, unlike the film industry, we as an industry do not just release a game and that's it, game over, as it were. We do not have that sense of theatrical release. Increasingly, the large proportion of your game budget, production budget, will be spent post-release in iteration, adding new features, adding new content, keeping your audience and your players coming back for more. So it's important that the tax relief was structured in a way that recognised that. It was also important that it...
What specific features would you have to recognise that, though?
Well, you would be able to account for DLC, downloadable content, benefiting from the tax relief. So it's not just about that initial creation. If you're talking about the film industry, the film and that's it. It's that post-release iteration, that post-release production that needs to count. You need to be able to claim...
It's the ongoing cost for providing additional content which you can monetize over time. It's the long tail of the game. Does that qualify as well?
The good thing is, the government have acknowledged that.
Yeah.
They recognise that we don't just launch a game now and that's it, then people move on to a new product.
So you're confident that ministers and civil servants get it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's in the legislation.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And finally, in terms of other areas, obviously corporation tax is one that can impact the industry. Are there any other specific tax measures that would help the industry to grow in this country?
SCIS, I think, is brilliant.
Yeah.
I think that the amount that is brought back through an income tax credit at 50% is absolutely fantastic. Because if you look at a small company trying to raise, say, 100,000, 150,000 to make a game, 3 people coming out of university, they've got a great idea for a game, they can now get it onto the App Store, so it's feasible to sell it, but they need 100, 150. They're never going to get it from the bank. It's not going to be easy to get it necessarily even from a crowdsourcing platform, although that will be the starting point. Friends, family and fools are the classic kind of source of investment for that kind of funding. And to get half of your money back straight away is extremely... it changes the entire calculation.
The other thing I'd add to that is to make sure the bureaucracy around the application and for SES, SEIS and EIS is not overburdening, particularly the small companies. I've had a couple of examples where it's gone wrong because the intent was not communicated to HMRC and that resulted in it not happening, which should be simplified, particularly for small companies. And the other area that might benefit long term is to possibly look at a patent box around IP. linked to UK production, which could ring fence to ensure that global revenues are come back to the UK on IP production produced in this country.
Is there anything being done in any other countries by other governments as maybe as a bit of a fight back because the UK is doing what it's doing? Is there anything to learn from other countries about how they're trying to support the industry?
Well, the tax credits in Canada have been the ones that have had the most impact. So you might look at, for instance, the very low corporation tax rate in Ireland. I don't have a perception that has had a massive impact in the UK. And I'm not aware of other countries looking at such generous schemes as the SEIS scheme. I think that the focus on helping fairly small companies to start up and getting funding into those companies, which is what SEIS does, is really the right way to go. And I'm not aware of any other country having a more generous.
So that's great for the new content creators, and it's no surprise that some of the our best studios in the UK have attracted an incredible amount of investment from overseas, because our historic brilliance, creativity matched with our knowledge of high technology. It's just that over time, we'd had our skills had become lower than they should have been, and our costs were higher than they should have been. Now that trend is being switched because of the introduction of tax credits and the introduction of computer science. So over the long term, that will empower our creatives to be, if not the best, right up there, the best in the world.
So are we keeping ahead of the game, or are we just keeping in touch with others who are doing the right thing?
I think we're catching up. We're catching up in terms of the tax rate, because of course other jurisdictions have had tax rates against production for a long period of time, particularly in Canada. So we're catching up on that front. I think there's still some things we could do on the R&D tax credit. I mean, we have a good R&D tax credit for small firms in the UK, but there are still some amendments we can make. In France, for example, you can use the research and development tax credit to claim for the cost of IP protection, and indeed, actually, I think defending IP cases actually where developers feel their IP rights have been infringed. So that is an area which the UK government could look at here with regards to R&D tax credits. In other countries, some of the Nordic countries, I think also in Germany, they have government-funded competitions for games. That's a fairly small level of intervention, but it's another one to consider. In France, again, actually, they also have a scheme whereby they will cover, I think, about 50% of the production costs if you've generated a genuinely new or innovative game. So it's a source of direct funding for particular game projects. I mean, I do feel once the games tax rate comes into effect, it will make a big difference to the UK games industry. It won't be the most generous level of relief in the world. Quebec will still have the highest. I think Singapore will still have a high rate as well compared to the UK. But nonetheless, if we do get a flat 25% level of relief, which all game projects can in principle claim for, that'll be extremely helpful.
And I think, just to Richard's point, Canada also has a digital media fund, so it encourages investment and covering of the development of converged interactive entertainment content, so working with broadcasters and TV companies. And we used to have that in the form of 4IP, which came out of the discussions around public service publisher. We don't have that anymore. Canada has that, works very well. Potentially it's something that we need to think about as well.
Can I turn quickly to IP? When we've talked to the film industry and music industry, obviously piracy, illegal downloading, huge concern. To what extent is it affecting your industry? And how do you regard the copyright changes that are in prospect?
We're very supportive of the copyright regime as it is. It supports our industry very well. We are classified as software, and we welcome that. So any exceptions do not apply to us as an industry, which we're keen to maintain under the European Copyright Directive. We, as an industry, have evolved our business models very rapidly. We've always been a digital industry. So we haven't had the heart of our industry ripped out of it, as the music industry have had, or the film industry have had. If you look at BitTorrent traffic, in terms of traffic for games, it's around 3 to 4%. However, we do support...
3 to 4%
of the traffic
of all BitTorrent is games related.
Is around games. We do have we're very concerned with IP protection. We do support enforcement measures, but we're always in conversation with our colleagues in the music and film industry, and we join those Advasi high-level roundtables on copyright, and we welcome those as a chance to bring the industry together. We're very supportive of the approach of strangling the blood to sites potentially, so through payment systems worked and advertising support on sites. That kind of work we're supportive of. But currently, the current IP system works very well for our industry. We have an always-on connection in many cases through consoles with our players. So many companies devise really funny ways and interesting ways through technical protection measures to identify whether someone's playing a pirated disc. So, for example, one game will let you play for a while, and then a giant red scorpion will appear and stop you from going anywhere because it knows it's a pirated game.
Sorry, where does the red scorpion come from?
It's something that it appears when the company knows that the game is not a legitimate copy.
Is this in the console? Or?
Mm-hmm.
So the console detects...
And long term, of course, technology will work in our favour as more games served from the cloud, in which you download the client and then it's streamed from servers from around the world. That's going to be a huge problem for pirates, and also the move from premium to freemium titles, where you're serving free content. In some respects, the pirates can actually be marketeers for you, because if they then pirate your game, it still has the in-app purchases inside it, and it also still has the advertising inside it, so you can still monetize content that's actually been put around by pirates. So, but we can never condone what pirates do. It's just that long term, I think technology is really going to work in our favour.
We also, face increasing problems more around cloning of games and trademark infringements.
One of the points that Hargreaves makes is to have a cheap way of settling disputes. And as Joe says, cloning is an issue with people copying games, and you can't go to court as an SME at the moment in the UK. Without risking your entire business on a lawsuit based around an intellectual property dispute, because it will come in 200,000-300,000, and then if you lose, then you're hit for the same again. And his suggestion to have a very low cost way of settling disputes is actually very useful, I thought.
And we would say around the DEA, we support in principle the educational benefits. We think there's a lot of work to be done just to advertise to consumers, to players, to parents about the legitimate routes to finding legitimate content.
Tracy?
Ian, can I just start with you? I think you co-authored a report with Alex Hope from Double Negative, reviewing the video games industry for the government. Was it?
Who's that, Ed, basically?
Yeah.
The Hest.
What were the gaps in skills that you found? And do you think that since the report was published that the government has taken the report on board and sort of progressing with the recommendations?
Yes, Ed Vasey commissioned the report, and it was funded by Nesta, who also provided us with 2 full-time researchers. And first off, we looked at universities, why so many university courses were simply teaching soft skills, the social relevance of games in our lives and some design, but weren't giving students the opportunity to learn hard skills of computer programming, art and animation. And we were wondering why fewer people were actually applying to do computer science, even at universities like in Cambridge. We found that the fundamental problem lay in schools, that the ICT curriculum, as was taught, was largely learning soft skills, learning how to use applications but giving no insight how to create applications. It was a strange hybrid of Word, PowerPoint and Excel, and had no relevance to children's lives who, as digital natives, understand this in a week. They certainly don't need to spend a year learning PowerPoint and then be examined on the back of it. So against all odds, we managed to turn them off technology for life for devices which they love so much. Children run their lives through games, through its communication, playing games. It's second nature to them. And so we made 20 recommendations, the main one being in the report that computer science be put on the school's national curriculum as an essential discipline. It was well received by the games industry, of course, and the visual effects industry, but beyond that, not so much. It wasn't until we formed our Next Gen Skills Coalition, funded by Ukie, where we got companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Sector Skills Council, even GCHQ on board, because we had shared a common need to have computer programmers of a much higher stature than was currently being offered. And it wasn't really until Eric Schmidt, chairman of Google, referenced Next Gen report in his McTaggart lecture in 2011, and during his Q&A session, that suddenly the government sat up and took notice. Because if Eric said it, it must be true. And that resulted in us being fast-forwarded through the DFE and through BIS and the other departments, and the penny drops that, to have a skilled workforce that can create content, not just for the games industry. It's important that they have the right skills, and computer coding, and also maths and art, etc., were actually vital to this digital economy. And net result is that at BET in 2012, Michael Gove made a historic speech saying the common programme of study for ICT was going to be withdrawn and be replaced with a curriculum that had computer science at its core. And quite recently, over the past month, he also announced that our number 5 recommendation to have computer science brought onto the English Baccalaureate as the fourth science was also going to happen. What we're still campaigning for is to have our other part of recommendation number 5 to have the same apply to art, because it's the marriage of art and science that's so important, not just for games, I keep stressing, but for all creative digital industries, including, say, for example, architecture. You need that visual aesthetic, so you can imagine what a building might look like from a beauty point of view, but also you need to understand the maths inside it, so it makes sure it doesn't fall down and kill you. So we're delighted the way the report has been taken. We're delighted with the way Ukie has supported our Next Gen Skills campaign, and hopefully this will be transformational, just for the games industry, but for all creative industries going forward.
And
Please carry on.
We just hired a talent development coordinator to look after the other more practical recommendations of the Next Gen Skills Report, and that's part funded by Creative Skills Set in order to help create closer ties between the industry and schools and further education, higher education. And crucially, one of the next steps in the Next Gen Skills campaign, as well as sort of introducing STEAM and pushing the STEAM agenda, is also to make sure that teachers, particularly the ICT teachers who are going to be transitioning to a rigorous program of computer science teaching, are supported and retrained, and that CPD is really helping them.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about that, because I think your written evidence is that 2/3 of teachers are judged not to have sufficient qualifications to teach even the outmoded ICT curriculum. So clearly there is going to be a sort of a gap.
There is, but we can't afford not to do it. If you look at some of the countries that have had computer science on the curriculum, like Israel, Finland, and more recently Estonia, it's no surprise some of the best intellectual property, high-tech intellectual property coming out of those countries is world renowned. So we can't afford not to do it. There will be a gap, and we are going to make mistakes. As Albert Einstein said, anyone who's never made a mistake has never tried anything new. We have to do it. We can't afford not to do it. Now, there's one of our Next Gen Skills Alliance partners, British Computer Society, and their affiliate organisation, Computer Schools, have 500 teachers able and willing to become centres of excellence around the country to teach other teachers in local schools around those schools, all to demystify computer science. And also there's an opportunity here to, if we can get over these sort of ego problems, that teachers become facilitators, allow the children to work together, collaborate, and sort these. Teachers can learn with the children. The children are enabled, just trust in their natural ability to learn, trust in their ability to teach their fellow children, and they can do group learning and collaboration. Now, as Ken Robertson says, collaboration is often seen as cheating, but in the real world, all our industries are built on collaboration. So let them learn from YouTube, let them learn Scratch from MIT. There's fantastic online free resources around the world. Let them do their learning at home, let them do their homework at school. And together, during this period while we're training up a new raft of teachers to teach computer science, we'll be able to get through this collaborative learning process. And also, there's also been bursaries were announced, I think 50 golden hellos for £20,000 each that Michael Gove announced recently, in that to ensure that computer science is seen as an equal science as the other sciences.
There's also informal activity that we as an industry do. So we run the Video Games Ambassadors scheme for STEMnet, which is sending industry people into schools, volunteers, and we have over 40 ambassadors going to be relaunching that and publicising that, because we need different faces, we need to recruit a lot more. But already in the last year and a half, they've spoken to around 8,000 children. So it's crucially important that we get those role models, that we inspire teachers as well as kids into the industry and crack it open for them, and then help support them in terms of career pathways, careers advice, and advice on how to teach science and computer science with art.
With entrepreneurial skills as well, or else, however, we ever in this country going to build the next Google, Twitter, or Facebook.
Richard, I think, did you write a paper on the games business? And is this the R. Wilson that is in the...
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that we've argued that, of course, it's really, really important to invest in computer science. Everyone accepts that. It's really, really important. And we've got to try and tackle some of the skill shortages that currently exist. No one disputed that at all. But I think over and above that, it's really important to emphasise and provide the entrepreneurship, the commercial training skills that many people need in the games industry. And I mean, one of the good things over the last few years has been the big increase in startups within the UK games industry. So I think we've had something like 216 new startups between 2008 and 2011, but 197 businesses in the games industry closed down over that same period. Not all exactly the same ones, but still nonetheless quite a high mortality rate. And so we believe it's really, really important that in addition to providing technical skills, we also have training available for people who actually wanting to build up studios, who want to set up their own companies, and you can learn some of the new monetization, discovery techniques, use analytics effectively. This is really, really important because if you want to grow the companies, you want to be creating a more sustainable games industry, we clearly have to ensure that management and leadership is as effective as it can possibly be.
And one of the people who spoke at the previous session mentioned the importance of, for instance, just improving the country's ability to pass probability and those kind of basic core subjects on which you can build an entire business. And I'd second that. I think that is a point where we're fairly weak in the UK at the moment, where we definitely need to do more. But that has general application.
Just to follow up, Rich, you mentioned in your written evidence about the decline in the number of students doing computer science at university, and Ian's just mentioned that as well. Those statistics go up to 2010, 2011. I just wonder, have you seen any change in that, and is there any impact from tuition fees?
No, I mean, I suppose the encouraging thing I would say would be that maths and physics are in the top 10, I think, for A-level this year, which is good. And one wonders whether, to some extent, whether the advent of higher tuition fees may be focusing people's minds more, so they can see there may be financial as well as creative reasons for doing some of these hard subjects. That may be a possibility. If I can just link that on to one of the other points made in the submission of evidence to this committee, also mentioned the issue about migration. Obviously, companies in the UK want to recruit locally wherever they can do so, but it has been useful, while skill gaps exist, or skill shortages rather, to be precise, exist in the UK, it has been useful to be able to use the shortage occupational list to bring in highly skilled and people with quite rare talents in some respects. Sometimes lead programmers, for example, sometimes producers. So it's very, very useful to be able to have that shortage occupational list, to be able to bring those key people in. The Migration Committee, the Government's Migration Committee, agreed with many of our recommendations, which we put forward before Christmas, which they published quite recently, in which they said the shortage occupation list shouldn't be automatically wiped clean after 2 years, but there was a case for keeping on software developers, producers, artists, and in fact they added game designers, which we're very pleased about, because we do need this really window of opportunity to carry on drawing highly skilled people from overseas whilst we're training people in the UK.
Yeah, I would echo that, especially it's the tier 4 restrictions on skilled labour coming in. I've had a number of instances where amazing programmers are not allowed to stay in this country. Now, we should incentivise them, A, to help the business here. Also, they might actually set up their own businesses and build business here themselves. So sending them or not allowing them to be in this country is, to my mind, wrong.
Just successfully answered what was going to be my last question. But could I just very quickly ask you about art on the curriculum? Because we've obviously focused very heavily on the computer science side. So what age do you think that art should remain on the curriculum? I presume that you're actually quite pleased with the government's change in thinking around the English baccalaureate that allows the creative subjects to still be sort of measured. But do you think there should be any particular age that children should be studying art up to?
Well, it's a bit like saying, what age do you stop playing games? For me, art and music and all the creative skills that gives us our competitive edge in this country should be taught as widely as much as possible. I think it's all about making subjects relevant to the individual, and if you have a wish to do so, you should be allowed to be indulged, because you're likely going to benefit from that, certainly as an individual, possibly and hopefully as a creative entrepreneur. So we're all for art and science to be combined, because our ultimate graduate is somebody with a double first in maths, physics and art.
Rules me out then. Good, thank you.
Nope, that's all we have. Can I thank you very much?